Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
To the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and this episode should be coming to you week of March 8th, and mercifully, there are developments in the movie industry. Theaters are beginning to open up with less restrictions nationwide, and there are more and more compelling films that are going to be playing there. So all in all, the movie industry in 2021 is trending upward. In this episode, I'm going to talk about a few action movies, starting with the new movie Boss Level, which you don't even need to go to a theater to see, because it will be available on Hulu. This film centers around someone who is stuck in a time loop, and inevitably every day they are forced to meet a gruesome end. I'll also be taking a look at the film Pixie, with the far-out premise of Alec Baldwin playing a priest who heads up a gang, and the film is set in Ireland. So for my fellow mix out there, definitely stick around. And the final film I'll be taking a look at is the movie Boogie, which centers around an Asian American basketball player who has ambitions to play in the NBA, but has to overcome constantly being viewed as nothing more than a stereotype. And in my final segment today, I want to just take a look at the film industry as a whole. What studios are turning out the best quality films, what actors are dominating the film scene, as well as taking a look at box office statistics. So, if you're a big fan of the movie industry, you're definitely not going to want to miss it. So, the first film I wanted to talk about today is the movie Boss Level, which is set for release on Hulu March 5th. This movie was supposed to be released way back in 2019, back in August, but missed its release date, and since then it's been delayed for multiple reasons, including the pandemic. But it is finally reaching audiences, and the best way I can describe this movie is Groundhog's Day meets The Expendables. The film stars Frank Grillo, who people probably know best from his role as Crossbones in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and he is pretty much just keeping up the tradition of if you played so much as a hat rack in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that entitles you to be the star in your own film. But he essentially plays someone who is stuck in a time loop where no matter what they do every single day, it ends with his death. And this is not a film where he gets to go peacefully in his sleep. He meets a very violent end each and every single day. At the start of the film, he has experienced this, I think the number was 144 times, and he still doesn't understand the reasons for it. So that will be the main question to be answered throughout the film. Why is this happening to him? But this movie just seems like a good old-fashioned shoot-'em-up. Frank Grillo, tremendous actor, definitely has the physicality to be believable in a role like this. And I do think it's an interesting twist on the time loop concept. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, this formula was perfected with the Bill Murray comedy, or dark comedy, Groundhog Day. And other films like Palm Springs have explored the idea of being stuck in a time loop where you're essentially living with no consequences. This film kind of takes the more darker view on what it would be like to live day after day, same events, no consequences. You're pretty much powerless to change it, which I think is a very appropriate view to take. Again, like, people live their lives because they believe they're building towards something. They believe they're moving forward with their life, progressing each and every day, getting a little bit closer to the goals you set out for yourself. And if you're just destined to meet a gruesome end day after day, stuck in a perpetual state of misery, I think that the dark point of view that they've taken and they've had the main character adopt is an appropriate one. And this whole concept of a repeating time loop, whether it's this film, a film like Groundhog's Day, is just an interesting one to think about and put yourself in the shoes of the main character and what choices you would make if you were pretty much living the same day over and over again. Would you be like Bill Murray's character in Groundhog's Day, where you're just taking advantage of the situation, making a bunch of promises you know are never going to be fulfilled, and just living up the fact that there are no consequences to any of your actions? Or you're going to be like the character in this film, who, by the way, is named Roy Pulliver, and he's essentially just clock watching every single day until he has to face his fate. So while this premise has been done before, it is good to see that they're taking it in a different direction. And that is something you've come to expect from the film's director, Joe Carnahan, who was the director for Smokin' Aces, as well as the Liam Neeson film The Grey. From his past work, I've come to expect him as a director who really plays with the idea of subversion, where he really knows what the audience is expecting and makes a point to go against those expectations in a way that moves the narrative along in a coherent way and isn't just a swerve for the sake of being a swerve. Boss Level also has a pretty cool cast. NFL player Rob Gronkowski is in it, in addition to former MMA fighter Rampage Jackson. Other notable cast members include Will Sasso, Naomi Watts, and Michelle Yeoh. And one interesting cast member here is Mel Gibson. He plays the big bad and the main antagonist of this film. And for me, it's just weird seeing Mel Gibson in films, period. I mean, I grew up when his name was essentially Mud. And for those of you unfamiliar with his story, he got in some hot water after making some anti-Semitic remarks. And that would not be the only time his mouth got him in trouble. So it's really just crazy for me to think of him being in films in general. And I know we live in the age of cancel culture where anything anybody has said is taken to the extreme and no one gets a second chance. But I forget what award ceremony it was at, but Robert Downey Jr. said something about Mel Gibson that I feel is very poignant. And he said that everybody who's done something wrong essentially has to hug a cactus. And the point Robert Downey Jr. was trying to make was that Mel Gibson had hugged the cactus for the appropriate amount of time. And I'm not saying that's correct, but he didn't act in a film for 6 years after he had that verbal transgression. And just taking a look at the person who's making that point, Robert Downey Jr., everyone knows him as Iron Man now, and a generation of kids grow up seeing him as like a larger-than-life superhero that should be looked up to. In the 90s, this man was out of control. He was in prison. And if you were to tell someone back then that Robert Downey Jr. was going to go on to have a career renaissance and be the face of a multi-billion-dollar kid-friendly franchise, they wouldn't believe you. But Robert Downey Jr. is a tremendous example of why second chances should be given to people. Does Mel Gibson deserve a second chance? A lot of people may argue that he's already been given one, and he's on God knows what number of chance at this point. But one thing you can't deny him is that he has this tremendous amount of talent and ability when it comes to being an actor and being a filmmaker as a whole. He had a career renaissance in 2016 when he made Hacksaw Ridge. The film won 2 Academy Awards, drew a lot of critical acclaim, and even garnered him a nomination for Best Director. So despite all the things he's done and what people think of him, he is an incredibly talented filmmaker. And whether or not he should be getting the opportunities he's getting at this point, it's not for me to judge. But on this topic, I will say, I do think he has hugged the cactus for an incredibly long time. And if he wants to continue acting, producing, directing films, I think he should be afforded that chance. And if you don't think he should be afforded that chance, you have free will. You don't have to watch his films. You don't have to support projects he's attached to. But if those of you out there are willing to give him a second chance, check out his new film, Boss Level. And controversial stars of the film aside, Boss Level just seems like it is a movie that is just set out to entertain. And that is one of the things that I think is awesome about action films. It's not so much about tremendous acting, Although this film boasts a great cast, it's not necessarily about the overriding message of the film, but I'm sure this film will get people thinking about different aspects of living a life in terms of consequences. Action movies are really just for those holy crap moments, where either through the CGI in the film or the practical effects, you see something that you don't see every day. And hopefully, given that this film is incredibly violent and one of the main plot points is the character dies every single day in an extremely violent manner, something you will never see. But action films can have that crazy, ridiculous, out-of-the-ordinary spectacle in a safe, controlled environment. So while I don't envision this film being nominated for awards or going down in the pantheon of amazing films, Boss Level just seems like a good old-fashioned entertainment action flick where the goal is to have a few holy crap moments, and commit some things to screen that you wouldn't see in everyday life. Once again, Boss Level is set for release March 5th, so by the time you're listening to this podcast, it will be available on Hulu. So if you're looking for a good old-fashioned action flick that may get a little philosophical with the idea of there are no consequences and living the same day over and over again, Boss Level may be the film for you. And again, the journey for this film being released is a pretty strange one. It was set for release all the way back August 16th in 2019, and it missed its original release date. And in June of 2020, Entertainment Studios, who held the distribution rights to the film, dropped it, which led to Hulu acquiring the distribution rights last November. So it definitely has one of the more unique release stories I've heard from a film. But finally, after about a year and a half of delays, it is finally available to the public. And all joking aside, this film really just seems like it's going to be a solid movie. And in the time period we're in, where good movies are few and far between in terms of offering the total package of a good cast, a good story, and providing the entertainment value people are looking for in a film, there's a lot of films out right now that are fulfilling some of those needs. There are a lot of films out right now that are meant to be carried by the acting and the subtlety, where the overall intent of the film is to make sure you're paying attention to the message and the conflicts that the character in the film is going through. Boss Level, again, I described it as a good old-fashioned shoot-'em-up, but overall plot and the story it has going for it, there will definitely be moments where you have to stop and think for a moment in terms of what were they trying to say with that line or with that expression on a character's face. But that's also going to be supplemented by a bunch of good old-fashioned explosions and the spectacle scenes that you can expect from an action film. So there are a lot of different types of films, ones where you're meant to look at the artistic value and the message that they're trying to portray with subtle acting and cryptic storytelling, and there are films where it's solely for the spectacle. Boss Level seems like it's a good mixture of the two, and it's going to provide elements of both, which as of right now in the film industry is a little hard to come by. And not to go too deep into the plot and give anything away in this movie, but in addition to providing a lot of great action sequences, Boss Level seems like it could be a pretty powerful message on the idea of depression. And this is where my amateur film critic part of me comes out, but the idea that there's this character who doesn't care about the consequences of what happens to him, is content to just clock watch and waste his life because he feels powerless over the events that happen in his life and doesn't care about what he does to himself with the time that he has. That sounds like a pretty apt allegory for depression in my opinion. And I know that it's strange that it's being delivered in this raucous, ludicrous premise-based film, but the idea that you are pretty much stuck in a rut and forced to relive the same events over and over again until you're able to get past the quote-unquote boss level, taking the idea from video games where there's this ultimate challenge that you have to overcome in order to complete your mission, or in this case, move on with your life. And I may be making mountains out of molehills and drawing conclusions that aren't accurate, but I really feel that's what the filmmakers were trying to get at. In addition to providing a very entertaining, visually pleasing film, they were trying to build it around a message of overcoming obstacles in your life that keep you in a rut and keep you from progressing. So if you're looking for a movie that can illustrate the idea of overcoming the same obstacle that is seemingly inescapable, or you just want to watch a bunch of things blow up and quality action sequences, Boss Level seems like it's going to have a combination of all of them. So once again, by the time this podcast is released, it will be available on Hulu. So even though movie theaters are opening up, you don't even have to go out and expose yourself. You can watch this movie from the comfort of your own home. Once again, the film stars Frank Grillo, Mel Gibson, Naomi Watts, Michelle Yeoh, Will Sasso, Rob Gronkowski, Rampage Jackson, and Ken Jeong. So if you're looking for something that will deliver on entertainment value, Boss Level will definitely fit the bill. But right now on the GSMC Movie Podcast, we're going to take a little break. Coming up, we're going to discuss another action film, Pixie. And be sure to stick around till the end of the show, where we take a look at the film industry as a whole and examine some growing trends in the industry. So stick around, we'll be right back.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Be sure to check us out on our social media pages if you have not already. I just finished talking about the new movie Boss Level, which is available for streaming on Hulu starting March 5th. So by the time you're listening to this, it will be available. Definitely check it out if you are an action fan and if you're a fan of the time loop premise genre. And while you don't need to go out to the theater to see Boss Level, this next film, Pixie, is being released in select theaters as more and more theaters nationwide begin to open up. As with many movie releases in the time we're living in, this one was a tad convoluted. And what I mean by that, this film was released last October in the United Kingdom, and now starting March 5th, so another film that'll be available by the time you're listening to this podcast, Pixie is set for release in the US market. And one positive thing I will say about the pandemic and its effect on, we'll call them mainstream releases, it is causing me to take a little bit deeper look as to what is available for new films and take a look at films I normally wouldn't even consider watching. So I will take that as a positive. It is giving movies that normally wouldn't be given the time of day by most audiences more opportunity to shine. For instance, Boss Level seems like something I would not even be interested in reading the premise of, but having done research for this episode, I'm really excited to watch it. It seems like it's got a lot to offer in terms of an action standpoint, acting standpoint, and an allegorical standpoint. So I guess it checks off the AAAs there. So films like Boss Level get a chance to stand out, and this film Pixie gets a chance to stand out. And I have to say, it has one of the more enjoyable premises of a film I've read. So this film is set in Ireland, which originally is what drew me to it, because I'm very much Irish. And the titular character in this movie is Pixie O'Brien, which is the most caricature-y, Irishy name I have ever heard. But veiled stereotypes aside, this character is out to avenge her mother's death, and she also engineers a heist in order to have enough money to set out on her own. But she runs into a snag in this plan and has to deal with a gang of criminals, which is headed by a group of nuns and a priest, who is played by none other than Alec Baldwin. And his character is Father Hector McGrath, and I think it's just another excuse for him to whip out his Irish accent, which, from watching him in other things such as 30 Rock, he loves doing. So, if you're a fan of actors doing stereotypical Irish accents like the leprechaun from the Lucky Charms box, this is something you'll definitely want to see. And I think it's just going to be fun to see a priest being the head of a crime syndicate where his henchmen are essentially nuns. Now, I was raised Catholic. I've never crossed paths with a nun. For old SNL fans, I did have some experience with church ladies, and the character that Dana Carvey used to do is fairly accurate. Everything you do is wrong. You should feel bad about everything. I was legitimately told one time in CCD classes, which is essentially Catholic education, that we had to do after school, and is probably the main reason that when I finally have kids, they're going to be raised away from organized religion. But essentially one time she was giving us a lecture, and she told all of us we have broken all of the 10 commandments in our life, including thou shalt not kill, because if you make someone feel bad, you are killing their spirit. And from her perspective, that measures up to thou shalt not kill. Yeah. So, that was just the church lady who oversaw, like, the youth engagement aspect of the church. I can only imagine, like, the next level that a nun would take it to. So, I think it's going to be funny to see that nuns with that personality of constantly trying to make someone feel guilty put in a position where they're actually, to some degree, hardened criminals. That will be an interesting juxtaposition to see. And all joking aside, I think the nuns are going to play a pivotal role in the plot to this movie. That is honestly a sentence I thought would never come out of my mouth. But given that part of the descriptor of this movie is the main character Pixie is looking to topple the patriarchy, and I don't think there is a more patriarchal organization on the planet, more so than the Catholic Church, I think these nuns are going to play a significant role in resolving the main conflict of this movie. And I do not keep up with the Catholic Church whatsoever, but I did hear recently that the Pope has appointed a woman to the role of bishop for the first time in the church's history. So while the film Pixie is a completely ridiculous plot and meant to be completely out there, it does have elements of art reflecting life. But aside from the comical premise, this film has a pretty good up-and-coming cast. Aside from Alec Baldwin, who is pretty well known and acts as the main veteran actor in this film, the main character of Pixie O'Brien is played by Olivia Cooke. And for those who don't know, she has been in films such as Ready Player One, critically acclaimed independent films Thoroughbreds, and The Sound of Metal, and she is set to star in the upcoming HBO spin-off of Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon. So if you don't know her yet, she will definitely be on your radar in the near future. Other young cast members include Ben Hardy, who played Angel in X-Men Apocalypse, and he appeared in Bohemian Rhapsody, where he played Queen drummer Roger Taylor. And he will be playing the role of Frank, an associate of Pixie. And in all honesty, I may have already gotten through the most well-known members of this cast, which I don't think is a bad thing, having fresh faces in movies where you can really just buy them as a character because you're not drawn to their past roles. Just to give a quick example of what I mean by that, anytime I see any of the main casts from the Harry Potter movies play any other role, whether it's Daniel Radcliffe, Emma Watson, Rupert Grint, they are not capable of separating themselves out from different roles. Every time I see Daniel Radcliffe in a movie, it's just, what is Harry Potter doing here? So I'm always a fan of getting new blood in movies, and it just makes the performance that more authentic when you can't recognize them from other roles they've done. But it is not like they're complete unknowns. They do have a few credits to their name, but the other members of the cast are Daryl McCormack, Chris Wally, Turloy Convery? Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Dylan Moran, Olivia Byrne, so there's two Olivias in this movie, Sebastian D'Souza, and Colm Meaney, who is probably one of the other most recognizable names in this film, as he was on Star Trek The Next Generation, where he played Chief Miles O'Brien. And he has had a fairly successful film career where he's had background roles in movies like Die Hard 2, and even earned a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actor in a Motion Picture, Musical, or Comedy for his role as Desi Curler in the 1993 film The Snapper. So I do have to give him his due for that. But while the film doesn't have the most star-studded, well-known cast, it is not short on talent. And again, I just love the idea of the Catholic Church being a criminal enterprise. I don't want to speculate too much on what that commentary is trying to say, but I think it's mainly just getting at the idea of how society is so entrenched in tradition and holding on to ideas of the past, that deviating from that structure in any way is seen as a major transgression. And I think that setting the scene as them in one corner as the main bad guy and antagonist to the film, while the protagonist is a plucky upstart young woman who was always encouraged by her mother, in her own words, to cause a spot of trouble. And that's where I think it's kind of cool that filmmakers play with different elements of the film as part of the overall message. Again, the younger characters in this film are not that well known and aren't household names. And someone like Alec Baldwin, who is well known for playing super domineering masculine roles, or at least he used to be in the 90s and even in 30 Rock, where he played essentially a walking personification of capitalism in Jack Donaghy, with him being cast as a criminal priest that is the main antagonist, and essentially a personification of in keeping with tradition and maintaining the status quo as far as societal structure goes, is a pretty cool way filmmakers can drive home the message of their story on multiple levels aside from just the narrative that is told on screen, where casting a person in and of itself drives home the message. And another example of this that is top of mind is in the Rian Johnson film Knives Out, where it's a pretty blatant metaphor of America's immigration policy, and the main bad guy they had in the film was Chris Evans, who, of course, is Captain America. So in that film, just casting Chris Evans in and of itself is essentially a way for Rian Johnson to relay the critique he's trying to make in his film without having to spell it out to people. And not only is casting Alec Baldwin in this film a tremendous actor choice, but it also does what I was talking about from the standpoint you have a face that is pretty synonymous with playing the alpha male character in roles such as Jack Ryan in The Hunt for Red October, again Jack Donaghy in 30 Rock, and also maybe his most famous role from Glengarry Glen Ross, where his character comes in, gives a speech on what it takes to be a man, and leaves. So without having to spend a lot of time on screen building up this guy as he's the man, he runs the joint, he's the one you have to look out for, simply by casting Alec Baldwin, who's built up a reputation of playing that role, the audience instantly recognizes him as someone to take seriously. And I'm a big fan of how storytellers are able to tell the story off-screen or simply by just the choices they make when they're crafting the story. With, I think, one of the best factors in this whole story being the fact that the main character's mother is dead. And that's not a new storytelling device by any means, but the fact that this is a film with the underlying message of the main character trying to topple the patriarchy, and the most significant influence she had on her life being deceased in the story really helps paint that picture, with the unconscious message of this society that she's living in took her mother's life away from her. And in multiple ways, there isn't a place for her to live her own life. It would have been nice to see their dynamic a little bit on screen, but just the line that I mentioned earlier, "Don't be afraid to cause a spot of trouble," gives you a pretty clear picture into the type of relationship they had with each other. Her mother would encourage her to upset the status quo and make sure that she wasn't afraid to break the rules. And yes, this is a film that is all about action and criminal drama, but it has the underlying message of feminism behind it. And I give the filmmakers major points for packaging that type of message in a film like this and not being too on the nose, and really broadening the appeal that it would have with multiple audiences. And the filmmakers in this case are actually a father-son combination. The film was written by Preston Thompson, and it was directed by his father, Barnaby Thompson. And for some reason that name Barnaby amuses me, but I'm actually more familiar with his work than I ever thought I would be. He was actually brought into SNL in 1991 to head up their new movie division for Lorne Michaels, and he helped produce the two Wayne's World films, the adaptation of Coneheads, and later would work on one of my all-time favorite movies, Tommy Boy, with Chris Farley. So if his past work is any guide to go by, the comedic aspects of the film Pixie should be quite enjoyable. And this is a dark comedy action film. Mostly, it is meant to be played for laughs, but again, The main character is dealing with the very heavy issue of losing her mother, and she's set on a warpath of revenge because of that, which will make for a compelling narrative as she all at once is trying to deal with that loss, pull off a robbery, while during all of that having to deal with the criminal Catholic Church, which just the more and more I talk about it, the more I just hand it to them for thinking up this ludicrous, outlandish, and pretty original plot. Just the overall premise by itself is a pretty magnetic force. And when Barnaby Thompson talks about getting Alec Baldwin involved in the film, who actually turns out to have been the first cast member to sign on, it came through just him being at a party. Apparently they've known each other for years due to the SNL connection, and Alec Baldwin being a frequent host of the show in the 90s. But Alec Baldwin was just talking to his son Preston, who again wrote the script for the film, and just talked about, what are you working on? He said, criminal drug pushing priests, and essentially Alec Baldwin just said, I'm in. And that is pretty much the same way I feel about the film. I've been looking for a reason to go back to the theater. Now that they're opening up, Pixie is at the top of my theater list. And while I do encourage people, if they want to go back to the movie theaters to see a movie, just have that feel of being in a theater, support the film industry in addition to all that, be safe about it. Don't get too close to people that aren't in your party. Wear a mask. Last time I was in a theater, I was watching Tenet. It took me halfway through the film to realize I was the only one in the theater and could take my mask off. We're not out of the woods yet, so I definitely encourage you to go back and enjoy being in a movie theater. Just be smart about it. So, if you're like me and jonesing to get back into a movie theater, I definitely recommend the film Pixie, the dark comedy crime drama starring Alec Baldwin and Olivia Cooke. The film is set in Ireland and only stars one natural-born Irish citizen. So if you're a fan of outrageous accent impersonations, definitely check this one out. The film, once again, is Pixie, directed by Barnaby Preston. Right now, we're going to take a quick break on the GSMC movie podcast, but don't go anywhere, as we are going to highlight the new film Boogie, which centers around an Asian American who has to overcome prejudice and stereotypes, and has the dream of playing in the NBA. And this is another film in the line of movies that I probably wouldn't have noticed if there weren't as many out there, as there are traditionally. And be sure to stick around till the end of the show, where we'll just be taking a look at the film industry in general, taking a look at trends, what studios are turning out quality content, what actors are knocking it out of the park in everything they do. So if you're interested in just having an overall look at the film industry, be sure to stay with us till the end. But for right now, we'll take a quick break, and we'll see you on the other side.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. This is your host, Rich McDonough. I just finished talking about the new movie Pixie, which will be in theaters starting March 5th. So by the time you are hearing this podcast, you can go see it. Pixie stars Olivia Cooke and Alec Baldwin. It is a dark comedy crime movie that follows the protagonist who's looking to avenge her mother's death, in addition to pulling off a robbery so she can start a new life. But unfortunately, she runs into members of the Catholic Church who are also members of a crime syndicate. So if you're like me and find that premise appealing, go check it out in theaters. Be sure to support the film industry, desperately needs it at this time. And be sure to stick around till the end of the show, where we'll be taking a deep dive in the film industry as a whole. Take a look at trends, take a look at what studios are on top, and which actors are crushing it. But right now, I want to take a look at a new movie that's out, also in theaters, starting March 5th. So once again, by the time you're hearing this, you can go check it out. And that is the film Boogie. And I think this film is another one that is benefiting from the scarcity of mainstream blockbuster movies that are coming out at this time, though that is scheduled to change starting this month with films like Godzilla vs. Kong. But there are benefits to having less obvious box office draws in theaters for movie fans. I, for instance, have been able to discover a bunch of films I probably would have never even heard of if there were the traditional amount of tentpole films in theaters at this time. And because of that, I took a look at the film Boogie. And I will say off the bat, the film does seem to have a bit of a cheesy message. Not to say it's not an important message, but it does seem like it's very heavy-handed, and the movie kind of screams something that they'd show you in middle school when they're trying to teach you about diversity and tolerance. But again, that's not to say it doesn't have an important message that could really resonate with its audience. So the story centers around this basketball player from Queens. He is an Asian American, and he has to deal with the stereotypes that come with being an Asian American basketball player, while also having to balance the expectations of his parents. His mom really wants him to be responsible, get into a good college so he can have a successful career afterwards, whereas his dad is very encouraging of his son's dream of playing in the NBA. So that dynamic of parents essentially having opposite goals for their child will be interesting as it plays out throughout the film. But the main conflict of this film is just the fact that he is who he is. And the main character, whose real name is Alfred, by the way, has to deal with being in an environment where people think it's a joke that he's even playing basketball in the first place. And this is a rather unique concept to see portrayed in a feature-length film. And that idea of clashing cultures, where someone's heritage may be one thing, but they identify with a different set of customs than their original cultural background. And I know a lot of people deem that cultural appropriation, which for people who don't know, it means adopting elements or multiple elements of a culture that you don't originally come from. And it's a very controversial topic. I don't want to get into it too much, but for people against the idea of cultural appropriation, adopting mannerisms and feeling a kinship to other types of cultures isn't a bad thing. It's a bad thing when people are ignorant and being disrespectful to other cultures, using other cultures' symbolism to cultivate an image that is inauthentic to who they actually are. But if there's just a genuine kinship between a person and a specific type of culture, I don't think that's something that people need to sound the alarm about. For instance, in this film, the main character, Boogie, his parents come from an Asian background. There are certain values and expectations they're trying to impart to him. Meanwhile, he's a kid who's grown up on the streets of Queens, playing basketball his entire life. So despite the fact that he comes from a heritage with a very rich history and set of values, his behavior and attitude are going to be shaped more by the actual events and environments he's been exposed to throughout his life. So the ideas of how he has to deal with prejudice and racism for being an Asian basketball player, while also in the eyes of some characters in this film, he is essentially appropriating a different culture and shouldn't be in the environment he's in. It's going to be an interesting dynamic to see how it plays out and the messaging that the filmmakers intended to send to the audience with that. And since I just mentioned the filmmakers, this film is directed by Eddie Huang, who is probably best known for writing the book that the ABC series Fresh Off the Boat was based off of, which also centers around an Asian family dealing with life in America. So he has a history of tackling this theme. And it will be cool to see this type of story being told on the big screen. And all the time while I was researching this film, finding talking points about it, it just kept making me think of a real-life example of this that actually played out, of an Asian basketball player that had to deal with racism and stereotyping, and he actually played in the NBA. And the player I'm talking about is Jeremy Lin. And I remember being in high school when Jeremy Lin exploded in terms of popularity. He went on an absolute tear in the NBA, making the Knicks relevant for the first time in maybe 20 years at that point, took them on a huge winning streak where he beat the defending champion Los Angeles Lakers that still had Kobe Bryant at the time. And I'm pretty sure he set a record for scoring the most points in a player's first 5 games in the NBA. He was carrying a pretty terrible team on his back for a stretch in time when their best players at that time, who were Amari Stoudemire and Carmelo Anthony, were injured. And he just became the show to watch. There was a big deal made about how he went to Harvard, and given that if you go to Harvard, the actual statistics are you're more likely to become president than to be an NBA player. He was such an anomaly at the time, and I think it was great for the league. But again, there was this element in the news where people were treating it sort of as a joke, that he was an Asian American that was lighting the NBA on fire. Because in the minds of some people, someone like him shouldn't be doing this. Someone like him shouldn't be accomplishing the things that he's accomplishing. And there were prominent members of the media openly mocking him for being who he was. I remember ESPN got in a world of trouble for having a headline that was a play on words, but it had a double meaning of being a racial slur. And what was that accomplishing? Here is a guy that is atypical as to what the traditional NBA player looked like. Aside from Yao Ming, there haven't been a lot of prominent Asian basketball players in the NBA. But finally, here comes a guy that is an Asian American. And the main story isn't that he's lighting the world on fire with his play. It's not that he's carrying a terrible team on his back. It's not even the fact that he beat the defending champion Los Angeles Lakers. It's the fact that he looks different, and that's the talking point, which is just ridiculous at this point in time. And those events happened almost 10 years ago, but Jeremy Lin is still having to deal with issues like this. In an interview he did with CBS, he talks about how he was called coronavirus during a game by another player. He's currently trying to get back into the NBA. He's playing for one of the affiliate minor league teams. But in this interview, he opens up about just the general racism he's had to face throughout his entire career. He said that once he started getting outside of the Northern California bubble of where he grew up and was playing basketball, he really started to experience racism. At Harvard, he talks about how he was pretty much called a racial slur every single game. And it's a crazy coincidence that him having to deal with these issues, as well as other issues that are going on and grabbing headlines in the news right now, coincides with a film like Boogie opening up in theaters, where it's committing the story of a marginalized individual to the big screen, while issues like this are very much a focus of the American consciousness. And I commend Jeremy Lin on how he's dealt with issues like this. He isn't taking a stance where he wants to sow further derision and spew more hate. He really just wants to be a voice for people that honestly don't have a voice. And he says he's happy being the quote-unquote Asian basketball player if he's able to spread a message that centers around tolerance and understanding. And another thing he said in his interview with CBS is that when it comes to race, Asians can't just worry about Asian issues. African Americans just can't worry about African American issues. All groups that are dealing with racism and are marginalized have to be on the same page and recognize that the issue is the same for everybody. It's ignorance and lack of understanding. So I respect Jeremy Lin a ton for the message he's spreading and the stance he's taking on this. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, he's got the last laugh on people. He's earned almost $65 million in his career and won an NBA championship with the Toronto Raptors. So anyone clinging to stereotypes on how he doesn't belong in the NBA, that pretty much shuts you up. And all the power to Jeremy Lin for fulfilling his lifelong dream of being a professional basketball player. But I did find it ironic that when I watched an interview with the director Eddie Huang, when he was on with Stephen A. Smith on ESPN, Stephen A. brought up this issue to the director Eddie, because it's ironic that probably the most famous Asian basketball player in the world is speaking out about these issues as his film is debuting. And I found it surprising that the director pretty much said he wasn't a fan of Jeremy Lin. And his exact words were, "They called you coronavirus, go get a bucket." And he explained that he felt that, like, the issue Jeremy Lin is experiencing isn't to the level that Asian Americans around the country are having to deal with at this time. But it was just weird to me that two people that are pretty much speaking up for the same issue of stereotyping a certain race and there was just lack of support from one of them to the other, which I just found strange. And again, this is an issue I'm most likely not qualified to speak on, so I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of their, I guess, lack of seeing eye to eye on a certain thing. I just think that reinforces the idea Jeremy Lin was talking about, of how the issue is the issue and anyone affected by it has to get on the same page in order for everybody to overcome it. So that was just a little weird to me. But despite the differing opinions the director of this film had, with someone like Jeremy Lin aside, the film Boogie does center around, as the director describes it, a pretty alien way of life. And he wants to enlighten people on just the different cultures that exist in America, with people coming from different cultures and what parts of their way of life are very prominent, even when they do go to a different country. So the film Boogie is trying to do a couple different things. It's trying to tell the story of someone who has to deal with racism and prejudice in their life, while also shedding light on a culture that really isn't that highlighted in terms of American media. So Boogie tries to tackle a lot of hardcore issues, but at its core, this is a basketball movie. So if you're a basketball fan, you'll enjoy it from that aspect. And if you're just interested in getting a sense of what different cultures have to deal with in America, definitely check it out. And to give you a quick rundown of the cast, the titular character of Alfred Boogie Chin is played by Tyler Takahashi, and the director said that this was an incredibly tough role to fill. From the point of view, there aren't a lot of bankable Asian actors that can also play basketball at a very high level, which this film called for. And he was discovered just by going to a rec league game. So to all aspiring actors out there, just another example of be out doing things, because you never know when you'll get an opportunity. Also in the film is another Taylor Page, who plays the role of Eleanor, Boogie's love interest, and people may know Taylor Page from the VH1 series, Hit the Floor, but she will be playing the role of the main love interest in this film. Other notable names in the film are Bashir Jackson, who most people probably know by his musician handle, Pop Smoke. He's in the film. He actually passed away, but he also had a hand in making the music for this film. The incredible Mike Moe is also in this film, and for people unfamiliar with him, he played the younger version of Bruce Lee in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And the host of the popular morning drive talk show, The Breakfast Club, Chalamet, is in the film as well. So, once again, the film is Boogie, and it is set to hit theaters March 5th, and this film sheds light on a young man's struggle of having to reconcile his goals, his identity, dealing with different cultures, all while trying to chase his dream of making it to the NBA. So if you like basketball movies, check it out, and if you're interested in seeing stories about different types of culture, check it out for that reason as well. And if you are interested in the movie industry as a whole, definitely stick around till the end of the show, where we'll be going into just that. I'm going to dive into just different trends I've noticed in the industry, like how music biopics are at an all-time high, get a sense of which studios are turning out the best content and have the brightest futures, go over some actors that are still doing tremendous work in the world of film, despite the shifting media landscape that we find ourselves in, and make a few predictions on what I see as the future of the industry. Again, COVID was a major wildcard for all industries, but it's hit the film industry especially hard, not to mention the fact that streaming is growing in popularity, and that is changing how studios approach film projects. And the overall topic of the film industry, quote-unquote, dying, has been one that's been made many times, that's been disputed just as often. But one thing is for sure, even if the film industry isn't dying, it is most definitely changing. And what does that change mean? What does that mean for actors? What does that mean for studios? How are those changes being manifested and resulting in the content that makes its way to audiences? So, I'll be giving my point of view, breaking down some numbers, and if you're interested, be sure to stick around. But right now we're going to take a quick break, and I will see you on the other side.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
The GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and I just finished up talking about the film Boogie, set for release March 5th, which centers around an Asian American high school basketball player who's chasing his dream of one day playing in the NBA, and shines the light on the trials and tribulations that he has to face being an Asian American in a basketball environment. So if the film interests you, once again, it is in theaters starting March 5th. But right now on the show, I just want to take a look at the film industry in general. Of course, like all industries, the film industry was dealt a major blow with the COVID-19 pandemic. After 5 straight years of eclipsing $11 million domestically and coming very close to eclipsing 12 in 2018. The American box office fell off a cliff, grossing just over $2 billion. And to give you an idea of what that number means relative to other years in the film industry, that's the lowest output they've had since 1983. And the reason it went so low is obvious: COVID-19. But there are still several important factors and a lot of changes going on in the film industry, so I thought it'd be worth highlighting them, especially now with more theaters opening up nationwide. So I thought it would be a good time to put the industry as a whole under the microscope. And I do want to make this sort of a regular featurette on this show, taking a look at the film industry, what news is out there. But for this segment, I really want to take a look at certain trends that are going on in the film industry, as well as pointing out some of the notable players in it. And I'm not going to really put much stock into films that came out in 2020 because the industry had to adjust on the fly, and the context around a lot of things that happened in 2020 will most likely never happen again. For instance, Mulan set a record for the lowest return on investment for any film ever made, and the rationale for that is obvious. It did not get the opportunity to have major theater releases. It was provided to subscribers of Disney+, so it did not get the opportunity to make a lot of money. So notable exceptions like that, I'm not going to put a lot of stock in, but I do want to take a look at other trends in the film industry, such as the rampant production of musician biopics that are coming out. And I understand the rationale behind music biopics coming out. There's a pre-sold fan base, so you're pretty much guaranteed that a portion of that fan base is going to turn out to go see the movie. It's probably a lot easier to sell the idea to a film studio when you're pitching a film that's based around a well-known figure, and it's the way for the rights holders to that musician's catalog to cash in on money. By featuring the musician's songs in the movie, you're reintroducing them to the public consciousness, which ultimately will translate to plays and downloads of that song. And I really feel like this whole wave started with the Straight Outta Compton film about the NWA. That film was such a major hit with audiences and was such a revenue producer, it gave studios the idea, we need to make more of these. Since that time, there's been a biopic made about Queen, which not only drew a ton of money, but drew a lot of critical acclaim, with Rami Malek, the lead, playing Freddie Mercury, winning the Academy Award for Best Actor. There was an Elton John film made, which, again, was incredibly successful, drawing a ton of critical acclaim, winning Taron Egerton a Golden Globe for his portrayal of Elton John, and it won both a Golden Globe and Academy Award for Best Original Song. So this trend of studios making musician biopics has not only struck a chord with audiences, but they've become very profitable. And I mentioned a few that have come out. There are still a slew of them yet to come out. Some of them that have already gotten to the casting stage, Austin Butler is set to portray the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, in his upcoming biopic. Bradley Cooper is going to play Leonard Bernstein in a film made about the famous composer. Timothée Chalamet, we'll talk a little bit more about him later, but he is set to play Bob Dylan in a biopic made about him. And unlike the 2007 film about him, I'm Not There, he will be the only one playing Bob Dylan. Jennifer Hudson set to star in an Aretha Franklin biopic. And other notable musicians that are getting films that haven't reached the casting stage yet include Boy George. John Lennon and Yoko Ono are getting a biopic made about them. Celine Dion is getting one. Lemmy, the frontman for the band Motorhead, is getting one. Michael Jackson and Madonna are each getting one. Even the band Heart is getting one. And one that I just find a little strange, Gucci Mane is getting a movie made about him. I guess he wants to cash in on the bump in his music sales while he's still alive, which, more power to you. But the sheer volume of this type of film that's being made is pretty staggering. And I'm not sure why I'm surprised by it, given that this has everything movie studios are looking for nowadays. Films like this have a pre-sold audience, so they're better able to project the earnings this film will make while they're making it. Which is why film franchises that are built around a set of novels, or in the case of the MCU, a completely interwoven universe that connects to each other. But unlike an interconnected cinematic universe, I don't think that this type of film has hit its peak. And I think you can expect to see a lot more of them in the coming years. So that is one type of film I think you can definitely count on seeing more of. And one type of film I think you can count on seeing a lot less of is the superhero film. While you can still count on there being a few of them, there are 4 MCU movies set for release later this year alone. I think that's just a type of film that's had its day, and audiences aren't going to be engaged in it the way they used to be. And there are signs that studios are already shifting away from making them. Just staying in the boundaries of the MCU, their most popular properties are being turned into TV shows. Wanda and Vision is a big hit. Falcon and the Winter Soldier is set to debut later this year, and Loki's even getting his own series. So Disney's already adjusting how they present that content to its audience, because it's just inevitable. When you hit a peak with something, anything in life, that is the highest you can achieve. And with Endgame being the highest grossing film of all time, I don't think there's a better example of reaching the peak of something. Between 2010 and 2020, there were 56 superhero-comic book movies made, and if that doesn't reach the level of oversaturation, I don't know what will. So whatever the demand for superhero films was, it was definitely met in this past decade, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the ultimate example of how to pull off a widespread, interconnected movie franchise. But I do believe that a lot of people closed the book with Avengers Endgame, mostly because they had invested so much into a franchise that spanned so many years and reached across so many different types of story platforms. And what Marvel Studios accomplished was one of the most unique movie experiences there had ever been, so people were interested in it from that aspect, in addition to the stories being told on screen. But once it reached the narrative culmination, with franchise mainstays like Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans bowing out of the franchise, it gave people a natural point of closure. And probably the most prevailing critique about superhero films is the fact that they're all so very similar in terms of how their plot is structured, which it's hard to blame them for. It's the traditional hero's journey where they have to go through trials and tribulations, step outside of their known world into the unknown world, and ultimately face a test which in the superhero film is facing a villain. There's nothing wrong with the formula. It clearly works given the amount of money that these movies draw. But after a certain point, people have seen something enough times and they want it presented in a different platform. So one thing I foresee is superhero films having a sharp decline in popularity. And I give props to Disney Plus for already getting ahead of that and transitioning their superhero properties mainly into episodic streaming content. Conversely, I can't wait to see what Disney does to supplement their film projects to make sure they're still laying golden gooses at the box office. From 2010 to 2019, in those 10 years, Disney had the highest grossing film 7 out of the 10 years. And if what I project about the decline in popularity of superhero films is, Disney won't have that to fall back on. So there could be room for a new box office king. And it will take a lot to knock Disney off of that perch, but there are a lot of studios out there making compelling content. One studio in particular I want to highlight, they're probably nowhere close to rivaling Disney in terms of a box office comparison, but the studio A24 has been cranking out some very quality films. They've only been around since 2012, but they're already turning out high quality films, including Academy Award winning Best Picture Moonlight, the Adam Sandler hit Uncut Gems. Their most recent film, Maniari, just won the Golden Globe for Best Foreign Language Film. So if there was one studio I had to recommend that people take a look at their catalog, and if you want movies that are fresh, unique, self-contained, where they're simply trying to tell the story that they are trying to tell without being concerned about a merchandising line, the chance of a sequel, or building a film franchise around, I would say check out A24 and all the films that they've produced over the last few years. They currently have 2 films set for release later this summer. The film Zola and The Green Knight. And if their past work is any indication, they'll be extremely entertaining. So the overall message I'm trying to say is if you're interested in seeing good movies, definitely keep an eye on Studio A24. Now, in terms of actors to keep an eye on, I said earlier in the segment we would be getting to Timothée Chalamet, and that is because I think he is definitely an actor to keep an eye on going forward in his career. The dude is only 25 years old, and he already has a litany of acclaimed performances under his belt. As far as roles he has coming up to watch, he is playing the lead in the film adaptation of the movie Dune, which is set for release this November. And I just think he has the natural charisma that's going to carry him to having a long and illustrious film career. Along the same lines of people that I think just have a lot of natural charisma that'll carry them to a illustrious film career, Adam Driver, I think, is also another actor that, when all is said and done, people are going to look at him as one of the best actors of his generation. Of course, he reached superstardom by being in the new Star Wars franchise, but the ex-Marine also showed that he has dramatic range in films like Marriage Story. So he is someone I think is definitely one to watch. And one actress I think it is worth keeping an eye on is Lupita Nuanga. Again, she benefited from being in the new Star Wars films, but her performance in the Jordan Peele film Us was incredibly stirring, where essentially she was playing 2 different versions of herself. And the range she displayed really makes me think that she has a bright future ahead of her. And there are a lot more up-and-coming prominent actors that I would like to highlight, which is why I said I would like to make this a fairly regular segment on the show going forward, especially as new films are released and there are more actors turning in terrific performances. But I would definitely need much more than an hour to go over all the deserving actors that are making a name for themselves in the film industry at this moment. And while there are a lot of talented actors in the film industry at the moment, and in many ways we're in a sort of golden age of filmmaking, in the sense of it being more possible than ever to bring an idea to life on the big screen, there is still this lingering idea that the film industry is dying, mainly because the average film doesn't draw in a significant enough audience, and major blockbuster tentpole films are forced to shoulder the load. Because of that, studios are being more selective of what they commit money to, with big blockbuster movies getting budgets that are larger than at any point in the history of filmmaking, whereas smaller standalone films aren't getting the chances they used to. This compounded with the fact that streaming services are growing in popularity, and this is detracting from the theater industry. So studios aren't able to make money in the traditional way they used to. So there are definitely obstacles that the film industry is going to have to adapt to. But the entire notion of the film industry dying, I think, is just an incredibly flawed one. No matter what the outside circumstances are going to be, people are still going to have an interest in long-form content. People are still going to have a desire to go out to a theater and see a movie. People used to speculate that the film industry was going to be the death of the live theater industry. That clearly wasn't true. So despite the fact that the film industry is facing an unprecedented amount of obstacles, whether it be shrinking turnouts at movie theaters, increase in home entertainment, or studios' unwillingness to take chances on more risky ventures, the film industry isn't going anywhere. As long as there are still people out there that want to create act in, produce, direct, or what have you, there are still gonna be movies made. And from a technical standpoint, it may be easier than ever to make a movie. Now, not all of them can be to the quality of a Marvel film, but different audiences like different things. And now, because of the competitiveness of streaming platforms, continuously needing new content to keep their subscribers engaged, there are now more distribution channels than ever before for people that are making this content. So as long as there are stories to be told and audiences that are looking to be entertained, the film industry is going to endure, and everyone who's been calling for its death the last couple of years need to find a new calamity to prophesize about. And while the film industry is currently in a very rough patch, that's kind of the way of the world right now. So it is of the utmost importance, if you're a movie fan, to go out and support movies you have an interest in. Now, of course, do it in a safe way, but now that theaters are opening up and you have the opportunity to go see a film in person, I very much encourage you to act on that opportunity. And by the time that this episode of the podcast will be coming out, it'll have been pretty much a full year since the world pretty much went into lockdown over COVID-19. I'm trying to be as optimistic as possible by taking solace in the fact that there is a vaccine out there and that we are slowly getting closer to things returning to normal. But we are not out of the woods yet, so everyone out there, stay vigilant, be careful, take care of yourself and those around you. Take the time to watch a good movie if you can and feel up to it. Go out and see a movie. And I can assure you that I will be here to talk about movies. So once again, I want to thank everyone who is listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And if you haven't already, I would like to encourage everyone to subscribe to the show and be sure to write us a review. That really helps us a lot. And be sure to follow us on our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, which is GSMC_movies, and on Instagram. I've been your host, Richard McDonough, and I will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.